today's meeting, April 9th, of the Audit Committee for Minneapolis. With me here on the dais is Mr. David Fisher, Councilmember Abdi Warsami, and Councilmember Jeremy Schrader. We're a quorum of this committee and are authorized to conduct its business today. We have an agenda before you. It is about getting two of our new audits back. One is a business continuity disaster recovery audit for our IT services that we have as a city, and the second is the Diversion Solutions Driver Diversion Program audit. We'll also receive an internal auditor update from our audit department and from Mr. Vasiliev. Could I move and seek adoption of this agenda? Are there any questions? Great. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. The second thing we need to do is to accept the meeting minutes from February 5th from our previous meeting. Those are before you. Are there any questions? I move adoption of those minutes. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. Thank you. I want to introduce Kirill Vasiliev is going to be starting us off here. Kirill is the interim help lead person in our audit department. And Mr. Vasiliev very recently was the recipient of a STAR award for our city for all of his work and great efforts. That's a really big deal around here, and I just want to say congratulations. Also with us in the audience, we have Ethan Ruckheim from Audit, and we have Huguette Essolat. So thank you for joining us, and thanks for your work here. We have others here that are part of the different program audits that have been conducted, and I'll let you introduce them, Kirill. Go ahead.
Good morning, Madam Chair, Audit Committee members. My name is Kirill Vasiliev, and I'm manager of the Internal Audit Department. Today for the meeting, we'll be presenting two completed projects, the Business Continuity and Disaster Recovery Audit of the IT department processes, which will be presented by Nikhil D'Souza, who's with Backbone Consultants, our co-sourced IT auditors. Also be presenting the third-party audit of Diversion Solutions, and then we'll be providing an auditor update with our work in progress, proposed plan modification for this year, and an update on our findings follow-up process. And here to present the first audit is Nikhil D'Souza.
Mr. D'Souza, welcome.
Good morning, Councilwoman. Good morning, Council Chair, and the rest of the committee. Thank you for taking the time this morning. We wanted to talk about the, can you hear me clearly? Oh, sorry. Talk about the IT audit on the Business Continuity and Disaster Recovery Plan. This was requested by the IT Audit Department as part of the IT Department as part of the 2018 Audit Plan. And the main areas we're covering is business continuity and disaster recovery. And business continuity is basically to make sure that the business can continue after disaster. And a disaster, excuse me, and a disaster recovery plan is to make sure that the IT and the infrastructure team can recover after a disaster occurs.
Mr. D'Souza, could you just go into a little bit of detail what constitutes a disaster, what kinds of things?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, Councilwoman. So the main reason we were looking at this is that what constitutes a disaster would be something where you maybe have an outside attacker as a threat that comes in, or in case there's for some reason, there is a tornado that goes through our data centers and we are unable to have an internet continuity, or we are unable to continue using our current systems the way we intend to.
So perhaps a way to say that would be an unplanned outage, right?
An unplanned outage or an unplanned event or natural disaster that occurred would be one of the two ways to look at it.
Thank you.
The main objective was to look at the objectives of the audit would look at a formal business impact analysis, which is what is an impact to the actual business in case this unplanned outage happens. We would want to identify and know the recovery time. So how long can you go without having regular operations, and a recovery point, so the point at which it has to be recovered to in order for normal business operations to continue. So a business impact analysis is basically your building blocks and your foundation for your business continuity plan and for your disaster recovery plan. Without a formal business impact analysis, you're not going to be able to fully define your business continuity plan as well as your disaster recovery plan. So there's no way for you to fully know what to plan for in an event of an unplanned outage. In addition to looking for a business impact analysis, of course, we were looking to see a formal disaster recovery plan and a formal business continuity plan was in existence, and to make sure these plans were implemented and tested. Excuse me. In addition to just having a plan, it is important to make sure we test the plan periodically to make sure it actually works effectively in the event of an unplanned outage that does occur. So those were the key objectives of the audit. And the scope and approach we basically took is we reviewed the city's IT business impact analysis, business continuity planning, and disaster recovery plan to make sure they were complete and accurate. And we did that by conducting interviews with them, and in addition to reviewing their documentation. And all of this was benchmarked against the National Institute of Science and Technology's version 834, which specifies what is the best practices for business continuity planning and disaster recovery planning in the event of an unplanned emergency. Any questions? We had two primary findings. The first finding was with respect to there being no formal business impact analysis. So while there is a disaster recovery plan and there are 6 applications on the disaster recovery plan, how they got to be on the disaster recovery plan is unknown. It was a legacy or a historical decision that was made by prior successors for the IT department. And so as a result, there's no formal business impact analysis done right now for us to understand the true steps one needs to take and true applications that need to be protected in the event there's an unplanned emergency. The finding number 2 was building upon there being no business impact analysis, there's no formal integration between a business continuity plan, which relates more as to how a business should operate after there's an emergency, and between the disaster recovery plan. And the main reason for that is that there's no completeness of the plan because of a lack of a business impact analysis. So ultimately, the main finding out here, or the main finding we have, is the lack of a business impact analysis that also leads to an incomplete disaster recovery plan, which leads into a lack of integration with the business continuity plan. And the one thing we wanted to call out is that there may also be certain applications and different departments that are not supported by city IT that may have their own business continuity plans. So we're not stating that there may be other areas without a business continuity plan. They've just not been formally integrated with the overall city plan. So, any questions on those 2 findings before I call on Audit to go through the responses?
Doesn't look like it.
Awesome. With that, I'd like to introduce CIO, Audit.
Just as an explanation, we often engage rather closely from the internal audit perspective with the client. In this case, the client is the IT department led by Audit, and so we like to give those audited an opportunity to talk about the process and give some feedback on the process, but then also to share, some of their responses from what was found in a way that can just be productive and informative. So welcome, Mr. Dahl.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Otto Dahl, CIO for the City of Minneapolis. As you heard, the disaster recovery facilities that the city has deployed in the past kind of grew up organically within the city, and it's something that obviously we maintain. We've changed providers of our data center services, as well as we have a new world out there where a lot of systems are being created out in what's known as the cloud. And these systems, these subscription-based systems, have their own disaster recovery plans as well. So with considering the new mix and also considering the fact that this has organically grown, we wholeheartedly wanted the audit department to look at the whole area of disaster recovery preparedness in the city so that we could formalize the need and then work towards ultimately creating a capability within the city to do a more detailed analysis and to, if you will, fill out any gaps that we find. And so I'll be talking about the process that the audit pointed out and exactly what we plan on doing to meet the recommendations that are made by the audit. First of all, we most definitely need to do a business impact analysis across the city. Information systems. We have over 400 information systems that are used in certain degrees across the city, some of those being more critical than others. And so our ability to have a catalog of the importance of those systems relative to the operations of the city is really sort of the missing link. We know about those systems, but we don't necessarily have evaluated those systems relative to their importance in the functioning of departments or the functioning of the city overall. And so the BIA will help us to identify that linkage of the importance of those systems to the operations of city functions across the city. And so therefore, from IT's perspective, one of our challenges is having the time and the resources to do projects like this. And so we will be seeking some funding to get some assistance through a consultant to help gather the information, help us with the analysis, et cetera, so that we can ultimately determine, if you will, what gaps we may have in our current approach to disaster recovery. As was pointed out, and I'll just want to make sure people see sort of the situation that the city is in, we have a managed service provider that has a data center where our systems that the city would normally run in-house, if you will, on their computing systems. That data center is located here in Minnesota. There is a backup disaster site in another state in the country that is used for our current disaster recovery capabilities. The sort of things that can befall a data center, as was mentioned, where you may have a natural disaster of some sort or some sort of extensive attack, cybersecurity attack. I think we're all familiar with some of the challenges that happened down in Atlanta here recently. And so the importance of the ability for us to basically pick up our information systems and have them operating somewhere else is something that IT has built in for a number of the critical systems that have been identified to date. And so our intent with the BIA is to understand what additional systems may need that sort of capability as well. The second aspect of the audit was to determine how do we integrate this sort of recovery planning into business continuity. And so again, we wholeheartedly agree with this approach. Obviously, it's going to take some degree of funding to allow us to set up facilities at a disaster site to be able to, as I mentioned, pick up more information systems and readily make those systems available elsewhere. It's more than just a prioritization of how we go about restoring those systems. It's also determining how quickly those systems need to come up. As business functions within the city are done today, some of them have timelines of their operation that have to be or is preferred or needed to happen in a timely fashion. I think that's more readily apparent for people when they look at things like public safety applications, but there's also other systems within the city that would need to be able to come up faster, if you will, than other systems. And the ability to have all that cataloged out, understood, and to formalize how we look at any new systems that we add in the future, and our ability to basically keep that a document that's living and effective at any given moment in time is what's really important as far as this capability of what we traditionally just view as disaster recovery. So in a nutshell, we feel and we agree the BIA will help inform us, and then we're going to have to take some actions when that BIA has pointed out any gaps that we may need to implement the capability of, whether it's to get more systems up quicker or to ensure that we have capacity for everybody to come back up in the city. And I'll stand for any questions.
Great. We have a question from Councilmember Schrader.
Well, thank you. Just have two quick ones. You mentioned requesting funding to gather more data. Could you give an approximation of about how much that would be?
We're currently looking at those numbers now, and so I'll have something shortly, since budget process is due in May.
Yep. My only follow-up on that would be is if that amount's going to be different than what it would take to create the BIA, just to know that difference and how that plays in.
Yeah,
thanks.
Fair enough.
Thank you. Mr. Fisher.
Thank you. Councilmember Palmisano. Mr. Dahl, I'm just curious. I've always considered BIAs rather important for IT systems. I'm just wondering why it hasn't been formalized to date.
Chairwoman Palmisano, Mr. Fisher, the amount of effort and the priority of things that IT has to do informs what we work on. And so this particular arena has never bubbled up enough for us to actually put it on our workflow. I agree with you, it is important, but through our prioritization process of the work that my organization endeavors to do each year, it hasn't bubbled up. It's one of the reasons why we chose to bring this topic up with the audit department in order to give us the visibility of this. It's not like the city doesn't have or has not had efforts in the past to look at all manner of preparedness of the city to operate should something befall the city. But this hopefully gives us the ability to not only raise the priority, but also to get the funding to pull this off.
Thank you.
Councilmember Schrader? Oh, no. Great. Anything else from anyone? Go ahead, Mr. Fisher. It sounds like from this conversation and from a brief conversation with the chair of Ways and Means that we would like to forward this to Ways and Means for consideration. We would also like to, through the process of this committee, receive and file this audit report, direct staff to publish the report, and forward to Ways and Means of City Council. So if that works for you,
Chair
Attorney
Palmisano,
Mm-hmm.
You'll need to refer it to City Council, and then City Council will refer it to Ways and Means.
Great. So let's do that. We will receive and file, direct staff to publish the report, and forward to City Council with a recommendation that it go to Ways and Means. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. Sure. We have a comment before we move on from Mr. Fisher.
Well, I probably should have said this earlier before we voted, but thank you, Madam Chair. You know, the identification of critical systems and the integration in the IT area is, I think, a pretty critical area of responsibility for our Office of IT. And I'd like to, at least personally, express some support for funding through the City Council to make sure that this is accomplished. I don't know if the committee would like to consider that as an attendant to the motion, but I'll leave that for others to decide.
Yeah, let's, does it, I'm going to ask
Chair
Attorney Trammell.
Palmisano,
Yeah.
you don't need a motion for this, knowing that two of you are already on the Ways and Means Committee, certainly during discussions at Ways and Means during the budgetary process, then you can bring the position of the Audit Committee up and the comments of Mr. Fisher.
Would we like to make a motion to show our support of funding for this type of remediation
You
or
certainly
initiative?
could. Mhm.
I'm going to consider Mr. Fisher having made the motion to make towards a show of support for funding the remediation for this audit. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Fisher. Oh, okay, so now we're moving on.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The second audit presented today is the audit of Diversion Solutions Driver Diversion Program. This audit was added to the 2017 audit plan in response to a request from the City Attorney's Office to review the program. This is one of our carryover projects that we have completed this year. The program itself provides a pathway for individuals to retain driving privileges when otherwise their driver's license has been revoked for fines or tickets. The program includes a vetting process and approval process by individuals who've had their license revoked. They go through an approval by the state, DMV, by an attorney from the jurisdiction that referred the individual to the program, and by the program staff themselves, after which individuals are granted the permission to drive and are put on a repayment plan to pay off their past due amounts. And as noted on here, Minneapolis and several other Minnesota jurisdictions participate in this program. The objectives and scope of this audit were to verify the accuracy of the data that Diversion Solutions provides. And this is tied into a state statute which requires that Diversion Solutions provide certain figures about their drivers program to various jurisdictions that participate in it. We were looking at these figures and were able, for the purposes of our audit from the perspective of the City of Minneapolis, and as part of that, we're able to validate that figures were being reported with the correct jurisdictions, and that the grand totals of the reported figures were lining up with internal records. The second objective here is to review internal controls at the Diversion Solutions, and the third objective was to review how the city is monitoring this contract with this third party. A few comments on our approach. We reviewed the various laws, documentation that was provided by the company, conducted interviews, and in general validated the information that we were provided. The one difference here with this report is because there was a component that went as part of a state statute required element. The report's really two reports, with the entire report having both the state element and our findings on internal controls, and the state report is included entirely as attachment A. Summarizing the findings of our audit, we ended up with 4 findings. The first finding is on database integrity. Diversion Solutions maintains an internal self-developed database to track all of the information for all the program participants, the individuals and the jurisdictions that referred them. We noted that the database had a gap in access controls, which enabled individuals from Diversion Solutions to log in as other users under their names. That would include individuals approving it from a jurisdiction or from the state. We didn't see any evidence that this was being used or abused, and the corrective action was taken by Diversion Solutions once we spoke to them about this issue to remove that ability for their staff to conduct this kind of access. The second finding is related to internal control improvements. We noted that the cash handling procedures were not formalized, and while Diversion Solutions did not accept a lot of cash, it is a generally higher risk area than a payment by credit card or check, and we recommended that those procedures be formalized. We also noted that there was a lot of reliance on the database to maintain a record of what occurred through notes, and we recommend that there be a more comprehensive retention of supporting documentation such as emails or other referrals in addition to whatever reliance on the database occurs.
Let me just pause for a question from Councilmember Schrader.
It just was pretty disturbing, like what you uncovered, and just wanted to make sure that when they said that they corrected it, that you went back and checked on it.
Madam Chair, City Councilmember Schroeder, we did not verify that the corrective action took place. We identified that the issue occurred and were informed that the corrective action occurred.
Thank you.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Thanks.
I'm sorry, Councilmember Warsami.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question about the program itself. Is the program effective, and has it helped people?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Warsami, as far as we could tell from our review, the program did accept individuals that otherwise would be unable to drive. It has provided them with a pathway to regain their licenses and clear their driver's records of anything that would prevent them from getting their licenses back. And it did result in significant repayment of fees that may otherwise not have been repaid. So from that perspective, I'd say yes. From a perspective of how it wasn't 100% effective. Not everyone applying and entering into the program was able to complete their payment plans and get to that point. But I don't have a good perspective on what would be considered the good benchmark or the target figure. I can also request that Mary Ellen Heng, who is the city attorney's office individual that handles this, provide some commentary either now or towards the.
Sure. I did want to point out that Scott Atkinson and Mary Ellen Heng are here. And Mary Ellen, you work the closest with this program of everybody in the city. So this is probably a more relevant question for you and from your perspective, how this is working.
Yes, Chair Palmisano, members of the committee, we have been involved with the DDP since 2010. Before I talk about that, I just want to make a comment about one of the findings. Minneapolis was not one of the jurisdictions that was having Diversion Solutions make entries under their name. I have done all the work myself. I do all of the approvals. I do it with, they've provided us with a very nice computer system. I do it all. I was frankly a little surprised that other attorneys in the state would do that. It's certainly not how I work. So I just want to assure the committee that we have done our own work and do our, all the entries that have been made by myself or my colleagues, Zenaida Chico, who takes over the program when I'm on vacation or out of the office for an extended period of time. So that was not really an issue pertaining to our involvement in the program. As far as the program's success, we would definitely deem it a success. Part of the problem is that people who need this type of program, we're not talking about people who owe a couple $100. I have seen people who owe $10,000, $12,000 just to get their driver's licenses back. Once you start kind of falling down that rabbit hole with your driver's license, sometimes it's just, there's no way to get out of it, both financially. And the other piece that makes this program the key, there have been other programs that have popped up trying to replicate what this program does. And the reason they're not successful is this is the state approved program. And the big difference it makes is when you pay off a ticket and you get convicted for driving after suspension. Based on your driving record, that may trigger further suspension of your driver's license up to 1 year. And they have, through the session law that we created, the DVS will not allow that suspension to go through. So once the person has taken the steps and they have become initially valid, as they continue to make their payments and pay off their tickets that they owe, they stay valid. So they're driving on the road with valid insurance, valid driver's license, and they're not accumulating new tickets. And that is really why I think this program is a success, because the key is to get them valid and to keep them valid. Part of the issue is some of the people owe so much money, and the way the session law is written, they can only work with them for about 18 months. And so there are some people that simply can't afford the payments over an 18-month period of time. That's why we've been seeking to have this program be made permanent. So that way payment plans can be made reasonable for people, whatever they can afford. If it's $5 a month, $20, $100 a month, but they can take, you know, what does it matter if it takes them 3 years to pay it off versus 18 months? They're making payments, they're being accountable, they're valid. So that's been one of the reasons so many people have failed out financially. The payments they owe are just simply too much for them to make, and we're hoping to rectify that in the future with making this program permanent and removing those time limits. But from my perspective as a prosecutor, I think it's been very successful. These people would never become valid without a program like this, and the way it's been set up, both the city and the state would not have collected nearly the revenue that it did, and it's definitely never been about the revenue, but it has certainly generated millions of dollars in back revenue that otherwise would never have been collected. But I think the more important piece is that we're getting people out of this hole. We're getting them licensed. They do have to have insurance. And that, from a public safety standpoint, is a success.
Follow-up question. How do we make the program permanent?
We are seeking state, that right now it's under a session law, and it's been a pilot program that's been extended 3 times. So we are going to, not this session, but I think next session, when the program is set to sunset again, ask for legislation that would make this a permanent statewide program. Part of the issue is, unless the jurisdictions opt in, there may be residents, you know, in other parts of the state that can't participate because their prosecution office decides not to. So we'd like to see it be statewide, made available for everyone. And we'd like to remove some of the labor-intensive obstacles, such as triggering a suspension when they pay off their tickets. That's just a lot of work that has to be done manually. And we actually have a bill in front of the legislature this year that would take care of that piece, which would be a benefit to the driving diversion program. But we hope that that the legislators will see the benefit of this program and make it a statewide permanent program for everyone to use in the state.
Thank you. Thanks so much for this context.
And so continuing with the findings for the report, our third finding is related to payment of program fees. In a small handful of cases, we saw a difference between what Diversion Solutions was to pay per their contract with jurisdictions in entry fees for individuals versus what was actually paid. And in a couple of cases, Diversion Solutions looked like they owed a little bit more money to jurisdictions, and in one case, they actually overpaid jurisdictions. So there's a small disconnect with contracts. And our fourth finding was the figures that were reported as part of the state statute required areas, where we ended up having to do a lot of back and forth discussion work to be able to reconcile the report figures to the documentation that Diversion Solutions had. And this recommendation is really to encourage Diversion Solutions to take that work and that report and roll it into improving their reporting, internal reporting of figures for the next required reporting cycle in 2019. So as part of our findings and recommendations, we did have a few recommendations for our city attorney's office focused around retaining documentation and doing internal reconciliations periodically to validate that the individuals we're referring to the program line up with what we're receiving in terms of program fees and in terms of any kind of ticket forgiveness that might be included as part of those referrals. And because this was a third-party audit, we did issue recommendations for diversion solutions as part of the process, but we aren't in charge of overseeing diversion solutions, so these are recommendations for Scott Atkinson to consider to improve their program, but it's not part of something that we have the jurisdiction to follow up and make sure that they're occurring. So I did want to point out that difference. Any questions on any of the findings or any of the areas for this program?
It doesn't look like it. Thank you. As part of this audit, we also invite up other people. So Scott Atkinson, if you wanted to say a few words about how this is going, I think that Ms. Hang did a great job to show how important this program is and how it benefits people. But just wanted to offer you the floor.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, council members, and committee members. You know what happens in business when somebody says the word audit, it puts a fear into everybody, right? It's like, audit, we're doing everything right. But nobody can do everything right completely. So I would just like to thank the audit team and the City of Minneapolis Attorney's Office for asking for this audit, because we truly are making all the changes that were recommended. We took it as a positive approach to sustain the audit, and the team actually made it nice and easy for us for that, and the understanding and the time that they made available to us so that we could better understand what they were looking for. And I can assure you that what has been recommended we are either working on it or we have finished it. And as far as giving access to our employees to make changes underneath city attorney or county attorney's name, it was there. There's no doubt about it, because we use it as a training tool with the attorneys, because it was easier for us to see, you know, what the attorneys were exactly looking at to train them at the same time. And we did take that button down so nobody can get into it right away when we realized that there'd probably be more challenges than not on the item and stuff. As far as the question of success, I just want to give you just a quick example. When the session law was passed, I promised to our legislators that I would work toward a 15% success rate. And that success rate was keeping somebody in the program, licensed with insurance for 12 months. I'm happy to say we're at around 60, 62% is where we're at. So we're just looking for, and we've helped about 15,000 people get their license back. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, this is exactly the kind of value that we try to have from our audit team and from our audit committee. So it sounds like it worked here, and we're here to make everybody better. And so great. Any questions? Wonderful. Well, I'd like to make a motion to receive and file the Diversion Solutions Driver Diversion Program Audit Report and direct staff to publish this report. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. Thank you. Auditor update. Thank you for being here as well. I appreciate your time. Yep.
Auditor update. I'll be covering the audit plan, both in progress and a proposed modification, and again, a summary of finding follow-up results to date. The audit plan progress will be split up into 3 slides, one covering our audits, one covering our consultations, and one covering the work that's being done by our co-source IT work. For the audits that are in progress, the Diversion Solutions audit is complete, and Minneapolis audit is substantively complete. In the process of drafting a report, but not quite time to finish that up and give the auditee time to respond before presenting it to this committee meeting. The remainder of the work is on track. I did want to note that for the records retention audits, our intention and plan was and is to coordinate with the city clerk's records staff. And as we had some initial meetings, we learned that their plans to conduct their reviews and the areas that they're covering is more substantive than we were initially thinking. So we're likely to be spending less time from our end so that we don't duplicate efforts. We're still working to coordinate those two projects with them. For the consultation work, we've held planning meetings with the fleet services, with NCR, and with Results Minneapolis areas, and we have a pretty good scope of work where we have several touch points throughout the year where they'll be reaching out to us with a phase or a completed section of their project and their work for us to comment on. We're also planning out our overview of this continuity disaster recovery in terms of mapping out what is currently out there within the city for reference for our emergency management folks. And then we do have a couple of consultations that are on the plan that haven't really picked up steam yet. And for the IT work, the business continuity, the second item on here is complete. And the last item on here is the third-party risk management process. That project was more of a follow-up to make sure that the way IT modified their third-party risk assessment process was effective, but they haven't had a valid candidate go through the new process yet, so there isn't really anything to conduct a review of. So that one is likely either delayed until later this year or possibly next year. And then there is one project that is expanded in scope somewhat, the IT police records management system implementation. We are conducting it as a consultation, but based on the phase of the project and how they're plotting their implementation, it is more appropriate to conduct an audit because a lot of the portions of the systems are substantively in place rather than being developed. So we can review and test what's there instead of consulting on how to put it in place. And then this slide summarizes those kind of adjustments in scope for the records audit, for the IT third-party risk audit and the police record system audit. And because we are very likely significantly reducing our work on records retention, we're proposing adding a new audit to the 2018 audit plan, specifically a third-party contract audit of AEG Management, which is the operator of the target center. A few factors led us to looking at this, including our work with Minneapolis wrapping up. We're both more familiar with convention center overseen contracts like this one, and we will no longer have a third-party contract audit on this year's plan. And the AG agreement and operations and renovation of the target center was something that was on part of our risk assessment for 17 and 18, but didn't make it high enough to really be worth doing an audit at the time. And the proposed objectives of the AG audit are looking at compliance with some very select operational provisions of the contract and looking at financial reporting. And of course, looking at how the city's monitoring the contract with the idea of if we're pretty well focused on key areas of operations, we can keep the audit to be a fairly narrow scope and not take up a ton of time.
Question from Mr. Fisher. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Was there a specific reason why the AEG audit has been added to the work plan for this year? Did somebody request the audit department to do this audit?
Madam Chair, Mr. Fisher, we were requested to sit in on several meetings that included discussions of how AEG is operating the contract, which included Councilmember Palmisano and Councilmember Goodman. and we'd also had a suggested email covering covering some aspects of a potential AG audit from the convention center head. So sort of requested, but also on our radar for a couple of other reasons, because it's somewhat similar in type of work to the Meet Minneapolis audit, where we're looking at events that are occurring in the city and how to get people to come here and participate and spend their money.
This is a tough one to measure. I just want to point out, and a couple years ago, we made quite a sizable investment in the Target Center. So we want to make sure we're getting our value out of that from a city perspective, from the public good perspective of how we want Target Center to work for us. So I am pleased to see this, and I do think it will help with the Meet Minneapolis audit, and it will be similar enough that this will be a good one to add. Any other questions? Great, go ahead.
So those are the proposed audit plan modifications. The rest of this is findings updates. So we keep an eye on the progress of the city and the park board in addressing findings that were presented in the comprehensive annual financial report audit by the state auditor. And this is in response to a staff direction from some time ago that we keep the audit committee up to date, especially because the audit committee receives these reports from the state auditor, and all the areas are corrected other than the federal award program procurement policies and procedures, which I believe our internal controls staff in finance are working on to resolve and are coordinating with the state auditors to figure out exactly what an appropriate resolution looks like from their perspective as well. For the park board, there were two findings that were carried over and reported on the 2016 CAFR, and one of them is corrected and the other one is still in progress relating to cash management and reporting requirements for federal grants. Next slides cover the follow-up of our audit work. So here we're presenting how many issues we've been tracking originally when these reports first came onto our radar, how many issues were open as of the last audit committee meeting, and how many are open as of now. Here within each set, we have both the kind of findings or recommendations, how many were issued with the report, and how many action steps management stated they are going to be taking in response to these. A lot of the action steps are sequential, so they'll be ticking down over time. A lot of the findings might have 3 or 4 steps, so it might look like reporting just on the findings, it might be taking a lot longer and not be as visible that any progress has been made. So I wanted to present both the findings and the action steps here. A couple of highlights. The records management audit target completion date is now 2023 with that is to implement their new information governance structure across the entire city, which was a very ambitious plan that they were anticipating would be done earlier than that, but has now started to be a later target date. They're also focusing significant resources on making sure the departments that are transitioning to the new building are ready for that transition with their records. So I don't think it's necessarily unreasonable for such a long delay. There's also an information governance committee in place now that is to oversee and make sure that things are going in the right direction. So depending on how that's set up, we may close that out earlier as completed, assuming that the work that is continuing and the plan seems reasonable. There's, towards the bottom, there's a couple of TBD completion targets for the entire project, and those are related to pending approval or review that's outside of that area's control, but otherwise have made pretty good progress on both areas. And then the construction contract review TBD is an area which was believed to have been addressed, but when we did some retesting, we saw that there were still issues similar to what was originally noted. And so we're working to figure out what that looks like and how we can adjust it and close it out. Any questions on these findings, follow-up items?
Well, if no one else does, I do. If we could just talk a little bit about what's become one of my favorite topics, the body-worn camera audits. It's notable here, and I really like this action steps column, by the way, because it shows that since last fall, we as a city have taken 6 action steps based on the audit findings from the body camera audit. But could you share a little bit more as to some of the work that's gone on since the last time we talked about this at Audit Committee?
Madam Chair, so yes, this was not on here last time, but since the last Audit Committee meeting, we did get an implementation plan from the police department, and so it's been added to our follow-up tracker. The action steps that are completed included adjusting the access to the evidence.com retention system for one individual that didn't need the level of access that they had. And then the others focused on making adjustments to the policy to either clarify something that was a gray area, include something that was a state statute requirement that we didn't necessarily clearly enough identify, or to correct an area or further clarify an area where it looked like there might have been some policy noncompliance. The policy was finalized on Wednesday and published and made effective on Wednesday. I reviewed some of it, and it generally believe it covers all of the areas that we flagged in the report, but I haven't meticulously gone through the whole thing. And before, I do want to flag that before we close out any of the findings, we do need to validate not just that the policy is out there, but that the policy has been incorporated into training which individuals have received, and any of the internal review areas that are going to be conducted would be able to catch similar instances of noncompliance if they're occurring before we can feel comfortable closing out the findings as completely fixed.
I just think that's great news. We will trust but verify, but it seems and it appears that not only has the police department accepted every single one of the findings from last fall's audit, but they continue to make progress in trying to shore up every single one of them. So that's good news. Are there any questions about that? Okay, thank you.
Next slide covers the 2 audits that focused on the Park and Recreation Board. Notable here is that all of the findings and recommendations for the HR files, maintenance and retention are closed out and we validated, and so that audit piece is complete. And there's also been progress on the Park and Recreation Worker Safety Audit. The timeline for completion, I think, has slid a little bit, in part because the plan focused on having a consultant come in to assist with several steps of implementing their program and to review current policies, and the time frame for getting that consultant in place slid about 4 or 5 months, but the group is currently in place and is doing work. And then to close out, as Councilmember Palmisano noted, we do have a new senior internal auditor that started since the last audit committee meeting, which is Huguette. And we are still waiting for a director vacancy to be filled. And we have started using and testing a SharePoint site as a work paper management tool that was set up with help from IT.
Great. I will mention that our new head of our internal audit department, that effort is ongoing. I've played a role in it, and I thank my colleagues that have also played a role in that effort. to varying degrees. Mr. Neal, who is out of the country right now, also played a key role in helping some of the initial phone interviews that we did a little while back. So I hope to have a much more thorough report of that and perhaps somebody in place by our next audit meeting. Any other thoughts, announcements? Are you through?
I am. Thank you.
Super. Well, welcome, Huguette. We're glad that you're here. And thanks for a great meeting. With no more business before us, we are adjourned.